Now that we have covered the items method and we actually have covered how we can iterate a dictionary using the for loop, we can now move to the next point, that is how we can actually modify something inside the dictionary. So to do this, the syntax is my dict, then square braces. Now VS Code is already suggesting you that you can actually choose one from these keys. Those are already there in the dictionary. So assume that I want to change my favorite number, that my favorite number has now become a float instead of a complex number. That is, my favorite number is now 99.99. So will I be able to do it? Let's check. Now I will be printing my dict, and let's see if the value of this favorite number is actually changed. So you can see that the value corresponding to the key favorite number has now become 9.99, which I have just changed. Let me just comment the above line and put it over here that we can access uh, a key and change the corresponding value using this approach or by this approach. So now we know that how we can actually modify the value of a key. We will now see how we can add a new key value pair to the dictionary. So the syntax is quite simple. To add a new key value pair to this dictionary, so let me just undo it. It will be better to copy and comment this piece of code out. So we will now see how we can add a new key value pair to the dictionary. And the syntax is obviously same. I just have to do my dict, then in square braces, I can actually add a new key. That is, for example, I want to mm, add my email into this my dict, and for this key, I want a value of my email. That is, for example, example at the rate 123 at the rate gmail.com. So now, if I'm going to print this dictionary again, you would see that the new key email will appear in the output, and the value corresponding to that email would be this. So you can see that the pair over here where email the key has a corresponding value of example at the rate 123 at the rate gmail.com. So now we also know that how we can add a new key value pair to the dictionary. And now we will be taking a look at how we can copy a dictionary. I will actually show you how we can do this by two methods. And the first method is we will be using the method dot copy. Yes, you would have probably seen this copy method multiple times in our previous lectures, and this method is also valid over here. I will just simply use the old name, that is my dict, and use copy method over it, and I will simply get a shallow copy of this dictionary. Yes, you heard me right, we will get a shallow copy. That is, These two copies will actually be different. They won't be the same object in the memory. And if you actually want to know what I do mean by saying this, they want the same object in the memory, you can for sure watch the previous lectures in which I explained how this copy is different from simply assigning this variable directly the mind it. As now we have covered how we can copy a dictionary using this dot copy method. The second way to do is to actually copy dict to is to actually do it by doing this. That is, we will create an empty dictionary, and inside that empty dictionary, we will put the variable myDict, which contains the already existing dictionary. And if we're going to print this cpdict2, you will see that the dictionary is again printed. So these were the two ways that you can use to actually copy a dictionary. Now that we have seen how we can copy a dictionary, it is the right time to move to the methods that are applicable on dictionary. So let's see some of the methods. A few methods, that is this dot copy method and dot items method I have already listed it to you. And similar to dot items method, there is a other method, that is keys method. And using this keys method, you will simply get all the keys. And let me just show you how to do this. So I want to get all the key of my dict. So I'll be using this dot keys method, and you can see that it returns a set like object providing a view on the dictionaries. So when I'm going to run this, you will see that we will actually have a collection of, this is a collection of this dictionary keys, and the dictionary that we cover is my dict. So these are all the keys of my dict. And in the same manner, you can actually have all the values of this my dict. When I want to print this line, you will see that in the first line of the terminal will appear all the keys, then there will be blank line, and then all the values will be printed on the terminal. So here you can see that these are the keys, you can verify them. These are the keys, and then there is a empty line, then there are all the values inside this list. So these were the keys and values method that you could use to access to the keys and values respectively. Now there comes a dot clear method. This dot clear method is actually used to clear the dictionary entirely. That is, it will remove all these values from values and keys as well from the dictionary, and the dictionary will become an empty dictionary eventually. And the syntax is quite similar to previous ones, that is dot clear. And when I'm going to print this dictionary, that is print my dict, you will see that the dictionary which initially had all these key value pairs will now become an empty dictionary. You can see that it is an empty dictionary. Mind me that this is not a set, and here is the proof that this my dict is actually not a set. We will be using the type function, and this type function, as you all know, that returns the type of the variable. You can see that it says the class dict. So now we have covered the clear method. So the next method that we're going to cover is pop method. So dot pop method is used to pop out a key value pair from the dictionary, and unlike sets, we can actually have the index of the key, and when we want to use that particular index, it will simply pop out only that particular index in the from the dictionary. For example, I want to pop what is my TGPA, and to do that I will simply use dot pop, and then I will actually use the key, that is I will be using this key, that is TGPA. I will simply write TGPA, and when I want to print my dict now, you will see that TGPA has been removed from the dictionary. Now that we have seen how pop method works, we will now be coming to the next method, and the method is dot get method. So dot get method, this method is quite similar to this syntax. That is, if you want to actually get a particular, I would say, a keys value from the dictionary, you can do it by this approach also, that is my dict and then the key name. But there are some limitations of this method, and those are, suppose if I entered a key that does not exist in this dictionary, then in that case, let me just undo that. Now I will copy it down. Now if you enter a key that does not exist in this dictionary, then you will find that this approach of getting the value of a particular key will give you an error, and you can see that it says key error, that this key is not actually existent in this dictionary. But we have a more better way of doing the same, that is, if we want to get the value of any key, for example, let's fetch the value of this favorite number again, I can use the dot get method. You will see that I have got the value of this favorite number. Now you might be thinking that what is the difference between this method and that previous method that we have recently covered. So the difference is that if I enter something into this dot get method, which is actually non-existent for this dictionary, then you will see that instead of giving you an error, it will give you none. So you can see that it returned us a none. And the reason is quite simple, because this fav keyword, this fav key is actually not there in this dictionary. Now we have seen that how dot get method works, we will be heading towards the next method, that is dot update. For example, I want to update a particular value, that is I want to actually update the value of this key, that is name. So how will I do it? I will simply use a update method, or I can actually do it by other way, that is you can actually do it like this, my dict, and then you will use the key and then you will assign the value. This approach is also correct, but we actually are having a predefined method to do this in Python, and let's check it also. So to do that, you simply have to use curly braces inside it. Then you will have to put the value and then the key, that is this. When I'm going to run this code, you will see that this new key value pair, this new key value pair will be added to the dictionary. Now, how this update method works. So this update method will actually check if the key is already existing in the dictionary. And if the key is not existing in the dictionary, it will simply add a new key and the corresponding value that you are going to provide in this update method. So let us run this. Oh, I'm sorry, I just tried to print what it returns. Now you also know that what this update method returns, and that is none. Mhm. Yeah. So when I'm going to run this, you will see that a new key value pair, that is key and value, have been successfully added to the dictionary, which initially did not have any value pair that was key and value. So now we have also seen how we can add. Let me just show you how we can actually update. So we can update by this approach, that is fav, then number, and now I will simply be providing a new value, and this time let me use a string 2, that is 67. Now if I'm going to run this, you will see that this favorite number has actually been added because the previous key was actually fav underscore num. So if I'm going to run this time, you will see that this fav number has been replaced from this complex number with this string number, that is 67. So you can actually provide this update method with multiple inputs at the same time, and it will simply check if the value is already, if the key is already existent in this dictionary, and if it is already present, then it will simply update, and if the key is not present, then it will simply add the new key. For example, you can see that this key value pair is not present, that is, there is no key such as this key, and there is no value corresponding to the key, that is this key. Meanwhile, I forgot to tell you that there cannot be duplicate keys in a dictionary, but you can actually have duplicate values for a dictionary keys. That is, these keys cannot be duplicate. That is, there cannot be any duplicacy in the keys, but there can be in the values. For example, uh, my favorite number and my roll number can be same at the same time. There is no need for them to be different. Now let me just show you what will happen if I am going to update the value of favorite number and I'm going to add a new key, that is key, using this update method simultaneously. You will see that this favorite number has been updated from integer 39 to str39, and you can also see that there was no issue if I had these two values exactly same for two different keys, and you can see that this key is actually printed and added to the dictionary. Let me just show you that if I don't update this key, you will see that having duplicate values will actually give us no error, and you can see that these two values are duplicate, but the keys are different. Now, if I try to duplicate a key that is fave number, what will happen? What will happen? And I will also assign them two different values. What will happen now if I have something like this? That is, I am having a favorite number that is fav num, and I have assigned it two different values in the same dictionary. That is, I have assigned it 90 once and 39 the next time. So what will happen? Let's run. You can see that this favorite number, this FAV number, has actually been printed only once, because if we try to have two values for the same key in the dictionary, it will actually update the former value to the later one. As you can see in this case that 90 is actually updated with 39. So you cannot have duplicate keys, but you can have duplicate values, as I have already showed you earlier. So now let us check what will happen if I try to actually modify the fave number after I have actually duplicated it in this dictionary. So let us do it. So let us try to print my dictionary, and you will see that even now there is only one fave number key, and the value assigned to that key is actually the lastly given, that is the most recently given value. You can see it over here, that is 87. So now we also know the dot update method in Python dictionary, and there are some methods too. Those are set default and from keys. Now I think either I will cover them in the examples, or I will be assigning it a homework to you. But before, I will mention them over here, that is from keys method, and the second method is set default. So these are two methods that I would want you to explore, and we will better be solving questions directly over them. Or if not questions, I would want you to explore them, because explaining them to a mere beginner is actually a quite difficult task, because I don't know what would be your reaction when you will see how these methods work actually. So let's move ahead, and congrats, we have covered all the four collections in our Python. As you have already seen that we have four collections, and those are lists, tuples, sets, and dictionaries, and we have covered all of them one by one. So we are now done with collections. So we will now be moving to the next topic, and the next topic is actually functions and recursions. Yes, you are hearing right. The next topic is functions and recursions dot py. Instead of creating two, instead of creating a single file, let me just create a different file for each of them. So we'll be starting with functions.py. So ever wondered why do we even need functions in programming languages? So the simple answer to this question is we do need functions to avoid writing the piece of code that is repeatedly needed. That is, suppose we have to add two numbers, and not add two numbers, because you will see that this is quite simple. So suppose we actually had to write a program in which we had to take user input and then print the result according to some calculations that we had to make, and then give the user a final output. And we have to do this 100, or I should say 200 times. So what will we be doing? So would you be actually writing the piece of code that actually does the same task 100 or 200 number of times? So the answer is absolutely no. And if you are wondering that you will be using a while loop and write the code inside that while loop, then my dear friend, that is also not a good, I should say, not a very good approach. You can do that, but no, that is not how programmers do. What do we do in that case? So the simple answer is we will actually create a function that can actually do some task for us. Yes, it will be doing some task for us, and each time we want to do this task, we will simply call that function that we have declared, or call the function by its name, and boom, the task would be done. And now if you want to do this 100 times, you will simply use a for loop or a while loop instead of actually writing this piece of code 100 times. And you might be wondering that I am using while loop in this case, so what is the problem with while loop that was initially implementing this task with the logic written into this while loop? So the answer is quite simple, because the maintainability of that piece of code inside the while loop, that is, if you're going to write it like this, the while loop, and I'm sorry, if you're going to write the while loop and the piece of task inside this, then this code is actually not maintainable. And assume that if you had to make some modifications, then you will actually have to change the entire code, and this will be a hectic task. But in case of functions, you will simply move to that function and make some changes to that function, and you are good to go. You won't have much problem. Assume that you are actually using this way, and if you did not get it yet, let me just try to explain it using some other way. Now assume that instead of a single task, we actually had to do 10 tasks, and those 10 tasks were to be done n number of times. So we'll actually be creating a while loop for each one of them, and simply executing the while loop every time you actually want to execute this sequence of tasks. That is, you want some task 1 to happen first. Let me just get more deeper that why do we need functions. So assume that I had to complete a task 1 first, then I had to do some task 2, then I had to do some task 3, and finally I had to do some task 4. So how will I do this task? There are two ways. The first way is quite inefficient, that is, you can actually use loop and then write the task inside the loop. That is, you can actually use a loop. This is the first way, and then you will write the task 1 inside this loop. Then you will have the output of this task that you will need in the second task. Let me name it output 1. So what we will do is we will do a task 1, then we will need the output of this task 1, and we will then use this output to perform the second task. And similarly, we will have an output 2 from here, then output 3 from here, then output 4 we will get from this task, which is the final output to be delivered. So will you be actually modifying the code for each of these tasks and each of the loop and each of the output? Will you be doing that? So the answer is maybe yes, you can do it, but it is very inefficient and very time consuming approach to actually solve a sequence of problems. So the better approach is to actually declare three functions, and each time you want to do this task one, you just simply call the task one, and assume that there are some modifications in this task 2. Then you will actually have to do some modifications in the task 3 and task 4 according to the modifications in task 3. And this is what where this approach becomes more hectic. Even from the earlier example that I gave you without any modifications, if you modified something inside a particular task which is actually in between the first and the last task, you will actually see a lot of problems and a lot of errors that will eventually arise in your code, and the program might even crash. So the simple solution is to define functions, and those functions can even be then linked with each other. That is, first of all, a first function will be executed, then second, then third, and then fourth. And in this way, you can actually increase the code maintainability, readability, and the efficiency that you will actually attain in a particular time period. So this is why we need functions, and now we have a basic why we need functions. So we also have why do we need functions. We have what functions do. Now we will be moving to the next, that is how do we declare functions in Python. So to declare functions, the simple syntax is, first you will be defining a function using the def keyword, then you will be using the function name, that is I want to define this function, and then here will come the simple attributes. Now, what are attributes and parameters? So this function will actually have parameters inside this, and those parameters are nothing but the values that you might want from another external, I should say, external source, and then use those values inside your function. So to use those values, those external values, you will actually have to define them, or I should say tell the function that I will be using the values that I will be mentioning between these parentheses in the function. So let me give you an example to understand this. So for example, I want to define a function, and that function will check if a person can vote. So, but how will I do that? Because I don't know what will the age of that person. So in this case, what will I do is I will simply tell this check vote function to take age, a variable that will contain the age. For example, I will declare a variable 18, and this will actually contain age. So I will simply say that you will receive a variable as an input. I will say that you will, with this function, you will receive an input that will be a variable, and inside that variable, something would be stored, and that something you actually need to check if that something that is age is actually greater than or equal to 80. And if it's greater than or equal to 80, then you just simply need to print that you can vote. And if in any other case the person is actually less than 18 or he enters some invalid number, you can say that you cannot vote. So we have also seen with this example that how we can actually define a function, how we can write inside a function, and what are parameters that we use inside a function declaration. So this line of code using the def keyword, and then telling the define function, then telling the define keyword what will be the name of our function is known as the declaration of a function. So we have declared a function, and in Python both declaration and defining are same. Yes. In other languages like C and C++, you might find that you can actually declare a function initially and then define how it will work later. But in Python, we don't have anything like that. And if even we have it, we don't use it. We go by this method only. So a point that has to be noted is that unlike other programming languages, Python actually don't have a different syntax for declaring and defining, and both of the tasks, that is declaring and defining, are done simultaneously at the same moment when we use the def keyword and we tell the def keyword what is the name of the function that we want to create. So we have now seen how to create function, what are parameters. You can see that parameters are nothing but the external variables that a function might need to compute something and then provide a result. So many of you might be thinking that is it necessary that we have to provide the function with an argument every time? So the answer is it depends. If you actually need an external variable to be a part of your calculations, then you will simply have to pass the parameter over here. And if you actually don't want any external variable to be there in the computations, then you will not need it. That is, for example, I just want to create a function that is print hello function, print hello function. So I will simply write print hello world, and when I'm going to call this function hello, I actually won't need to give any value inside these parentheses. Now we have actually started talking about the calling of this function. So after we define a function like this, we actually call the function by simply typing the name and then using the parentheses. And if there is something to be passed, like it was in the previous case age, we will simply give the value of the age like this. And we can also use variables like this if we want to take user input. So if we are going to run this program, you will see simply that hello world is printed on the terminal, and we actually didn't have to give anything to this print hello function as an argument. Now there are certain confusions regarding which one to call parameter and which one to call argument. Let me just use the previous example that was about if a person can vote or not. So here is the example. Now if I try to call this function and I just run this code without giving it input for this parameter, you will see that there is an error stating that you have actually missed a required positional argument. So remember that you will simply get an error if you did not give the argument to a function that it needs. Now, which one is the argument and which one is the parameter? So, parameter is that piece of words or the variable or the value that you are actually passing to the function at the time of the function declaration and definition. So, what do I mean? I mean that parameter is actually that quantity that you will be using to tell the def function that to tell the def keyword that this function will actually use something, and that something is parameter. I hope you would have got it by now. And argument is something that you actually tell the function that use this in your computations. That is, I want to give this as the value of age. So this is a parameter and this is an argument. And I know that it can be slightly confusing for you because I consider you as a perfect beginner that who does not know anything about programming. This might be a bit confusing for you, but don't worry, you will get it with time, if not now. You can actually rewind the video and watch it again to better understand what I mean. Now that we have already created a simple function to check if a person can vote or not, let us run it and check if a person can vote. So you can see over here that the output is yes, you can vote. And meanwhile, I forgot that we actually discovered another error that I have already explained. Now I want the user to enter his age or her age instead of me or the programmer manually entering his age. So in that case, you can simply create a variable by the same name. It doesn't matter. And how we can create a variable that is already over here, this we will be covering now. Not now, but a few moments later. But till then, you need to wait. I will simply tell enter your age, and I will give this age as a input. So when I'm going to run this program, what will happen? You will simply see that first of all, this line of code will be executed, and then this line of code will be executed. So we will be entering our age first, and then the function will run. Let me just rerun the program. You can see that we will enter our age first. That is, suppose my age is 56, and if I enter, you will see that you can vote. Suppose my age is 10. I should not be able to vote in this case, so you can see you cannot vote. And if I typed accidentally something like negative of 234234243, you will see that it will simply give me that you cannot vote. So the program or the function works fine. So we have also seen that how we can actually create a function, then how we can define parameters for it, then how we can pass argument for that parameter, and how we can take a user input and then use it as a parameter. We have almost covered every aspect of the function. But now let us come to the point where I wanted to tell you how we can actually use this the same keyword, that is this age, at two different places, and at each place it does a different task. So here comes the concept of scope. Yes, you heard me right, the concept of scope. So what do I mean by scope? So let me just comment it out over here. And it will be better if I'm going to create a text file inside this lecture 6 and name it scope.txt. So what do I mean by scope? So scope is nothing but the area of influence of a particular, now I can use the term function safely. So scope is nothing but the area of influence of a function. Yes, you heard me, the area of influence of a function. So area of influence. Remember the example of a king that I gave you? I told you that if a king actually passes a passes an order for his territory, the same order will not be accepted by the people who are ruled by some other king, because that is out of his rule, that is out of his scope, that is out of his scope, mind me. So scope is nothing but the area of influence or the rule or the yes or the rule or the area of rule. So now you know what scope means. Let me tell you that how scope functions in Python. So for you to know at beginner level, you just need to know that there are two there are two types of scopes for you at beginner level, and those are the local scope and the global scope. And you can understand it like this. For local scope, you can think it of like uh, in India, we have governments at two levels. Those are central government and state government. Now, if the central government has given orders to the state government that you need to implement this in your state, let us assume for now that the state government will have to actually do that task. They cannot deny the central government because central government is a higher authority than the local government. In the same way, the global scope and the local scope work. Now, anything and everything that you are writing in the program, that is this everything, the whole file is actually the global scope. That is, this whole file is the central government. And if I decide to declare something in the, if I decide to declare a function in this file, that is, I have already declared a function that is check vote in this file. This function is actually having its own rule, that is its own scope. You can see that this is the scope of this function. So the scope is the area that this function can actually control and rule over. That is scope. So this check vote function can actually rule up to here only. And the reason is simple, that we have defined this function up to here only. Beyond this point, this very point, this point, you can see the last brace, the last parenthesis, the rule of this check vote function cannot actually exist. I can say that this check vote function cannot rule after it actually has come to this final boundary in this case, because we have defined this function up to here only. So it won't be able to rule beyond this parenthesis, because we have not actually defined anything else beyond this parenthesis in this function. So this was local scope, and the whole file is actually a global scope. And because of the concept of local scope and global scope, or you can say the local rule and the global rule, there arise the concept of local variables and global variables. So variables. And what is the main difference between local variables and global variables, you might be thinking. And the answer to this question is, local variables are actually localized to this particular area only. Now, to understand this better, let us come back to the example of kings. Assume that a king, a king has actually ordered a servant, that is this age, to exist, to actually go and circulate in that, in his territory, that I will now reduce the tax by 1% in my territory. So what will happen? This ruler, this local ruler, will tell to the servant, and the servant will go and declare everywhere that the king has now reduced the tax prices by 1%. What if the servant actually goes to the other territory ruled by some other local ruler, and also start to announce over there that the king has now reduced the price by 1%? What will happen in that case? Will the prices be reduced? The answer is no, because the king of the other territory has not ordered. The person who was making that announcement in the other territory might be hanged by that king, the local king of the other territory. So, in the same way, these local variables work. They actually can work only inside the local scope, that is the local scope of this function, and they actually cannot work outside the local scope, that is the global scope. Meanwhile, assume that a king who has 10 kings underneath working, or you can say there is a very big empire, and the empire has a emperor, and under that emperor he is actually having some rulers. You can let me just write it down over here. Suppose there is a big empire, and let me just denote it using the comments. uh, yeah, so this is a big empire of a very renowned emperor, and inside this empire he's actually having n, or I should in this case use a fixed number. So in this case he's actually having this 10 territories, and those 10 territories have 10 different rulers, and these 10 different rulers are actually having powers like king. But if the emperor let me just make the emperor over here, and I will denote it by using asterisk. Now this asterisk is the emperor, and if this emperor who controls this entire thing orders the kings under his empire to do or implement a specific task, these kings have to do that. So now let us come back to the example to understand how local variables and global variables actually differ. Now let us assume that there is an emperor. This star denotes the emperor, and this pound symbols denotes his empire. So let us assume that that empire had these mini territories, and each of these territories actually had a ruler. Okay, these it had a rulers. This single asterisk. These are the rulers for this respective territory. Now, what if this emperor? Now, what if this ruler decided to actually change something in his territory? So one more thing before I need to tell you that this emperor has given them some powers that they can actually implement something for their individual territories. That is, they can, for the welfare of their territory, implement some rules. They can control something for the welfare of their territory, each of the individual ruler. But if something is ordered by the emperor, then it will be actually implemented on the whole empire. Now, to understand global variable, so let us first come to the local variable. To understand local variable, now let us assume that this ruler he actually thought of he actually thought of increasing the tax percentage for his territory, and he to do so called his friend called his servant this servant and said to him that go to my territory and declare everywhere that I have now decided to reduce the tax. And this servant went to each corner of the territory that was ruled by this ruler only and declared that the tax has now been reduced. Now, what if this servant tried to actually go to this territory and then simply start announcing that the this that the ruler has now actually reduced the tax? What will happen? Will the tax in this territory be reduced? So the answer is no. The tax will not be reduced simply because this ruler of this territory, has not actually made the decision for this territory. It was this ruler who made the decision for his territory, and the decision is actually to be implemented on this particular area only. So this is how local scope works. If there is something inside the local scope that is a local variable, it will only be alive in this particular local scope, that is in the territory of this particular local ruler, not in some other territory, not in some other territory. Yes, but suppose if the emperor who actually rules the entire empire, and under his rule come these six these six rulers. So what if the emperor say that I actually want to reduce the tax, but the prices of the items will actually increase by 1%. I will reduce the tax by 5%, but the prices should increase by 1%. Now you might be thinking that what is this random order? Is the emperor fool? So please don't go into such depths. Just think what I just try to understand what I'm trying to tell you. Now, if he prepares an order and sends it to his empire, each of these rulers will have to follow them, and this is where the local ruler will have to follow the global ruler, and this entire scope where the global ruler or the global empire, I should say the word empire. So entire the entire place where the emperor rule is implemented, that is his empire, is the global scope in the file, and all the other mini rulers or these rulers are having their own territory, and that territory follows only their rules as well as the emperor rules. And this territory is actually nothing but the local scope, and this whole empire is nothing but the global scope. Now I hope you would have understood it better that local scope variables, these local scope variables can only be used in the designated area of that, or I should say the designated scope of that particular function. But the global variables or the global data can be used anywhere in the entire file. That is, even this function can use it, even this can use it, this can use it, this can use it, this can use it, and even this can use it. And if there is some other function that we want to create, like if I want to create some other function or another territory, then even that territory can actually use this global variable. And this is the main difference between how the local scope and the global scope works, and what are local variables and what are local global variables. I hope you would have actually understood it much better by this example. Let me just give you an example. What if I declared a variable that is a is equal to 10, and what if now I want to create a for loop, and inside this for loop for I in range that is 0 to 5, I want to I actually want to increase the value of this 10 each time this for loop iterates over I. That is, each time the value of I increases, the value of A should also increase. So to do this, I will actually have to access the value of this global variable A. And since it is a global variable, it can be accessed anywhere in this entire file. So I will be able to access it over here too. I will simply do A is equal to 10 plus 1, or let me make it A is equal to A plus 1. So A will actually increase by 1 each time I is actually increased by 1 by this for loop. And when I'm going to print this A using the print function, you will simply see that A has now become 15 because it was actually increased 5 times in the for loop. So you can see that we can actually access and modify the data of a global variable inside a local function. That is, the order of the emperor can be implemented in the territory of a local ruler. Since we have already seen the example related to global variable using the for loop, we will now see the example related to the local variable using the function definition. So let me just create a function that is add, and this function will accept two integers, that is number 1 and number 2. And inside this, let me just let me just make it quite more simple. Instead of assigning two parameters to this add function, we will simply take two inputs from the user, and we will use those two numbers to add using the addition operator. Enter the first number, and similarly we will copy this line, and in the same manner we will be using. Now we have two numbers, and both of those numbers we will be taking as an input from the user. You need to see in this case that these two variables are actually defined inside this add function. That is, so these two variables will only work when they are actually inside the scope of this add function, because they are actually defined inside the scope of this add function. So when I will call this function and run this program, you can see that it asks me to enter the first number, then I will enter the second number, and I can now get the output as the sum of these two numbers. But what if I try to print the number 1 outside the scope of this add function? So sorry, let me just try printing it again. Print number, and I will just comment this line out. So when I am going to run this piece of code, you will see that it will give me an error after it prints the sum of these two numbers. You can say that, let me clear the terminal, and now you can see that it says that this print statement actually is trying to access something that is not defined. But we have defined this number num1 inside the add function. So why are not we able to actually access it? And the reason, I hope, is clear to you, that this is a local variable, and this local variable is actually localized to the local scope of this function. And since I am trying to print it outside the local scope, that is outside the territory of this ruler add function, this print function will give me an error because it is unaware that there is a num1 like something existing in our code. So I hope by now it would be clear to you that what is the difference between a global variable and a local variable.